In the summer of 1567, Scotland crowned a king who could not yet walk. He could not speak. He did not understand power, or fear, or the danger that surrounded him. Yet from that moment, the fate of an entire kingdom, and eventually two kingdoms, would rest quietly upon his small shoulders. Tonight we journey back to the troubled childhood of James VI, a boy raised among conspiracies, betrayals, and uneasy guardians, who would one day become ruler of both Scotland and England. The story of James begins not with triumph, but with uncertainty. In the summer of 1567, Scotland found itself exhausted by conflict. Noble families argued over power, alliances shifted without warning, and the fate of the kingdom seemed to rest on fragile decisions made behind heavy wooden doors. At the centre of this storm stood a child. James was not yet a year old. He could not understand the murmured conversations that followed him through corridors of stone, nor the fearful looks exchanged by those sworn to protect him. Yet on a quiet July morning, he was carried into the great hall at Stirling Castle and crowned King of Scots. The ceremony itself was solemn rather than joyful. Outside, the winds moved across the hills and lochs of central Scotland, while inside, flickering candlelight reflected from armour, from polished metal cups, and from the anxious eyes of gathered lords. The crown placed upon the infant's head was heavy with meaning. It symbolised continuity, stability, and hope for a land that had known too much unrest. But it also symbolised danger, for a king who could not yet walk could not rule. Power would instead pass quietly into the hands of regents, noblemen who would govern in his name, while shaping the future of Scotland according to their own ambitions. James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been forced to give up her throne only days before. Her abdication marked the end of a turbulent chapter in Scottish history. Yet it also began a new and uncertain one. The infant king would grow up in a kingdom divided between religious factions, political loyalties, and deep personal rivalries. Even in these earliest days, the young James became more symbol than child. Carried from chamber to chamber, watched constantly, spoken about rather than spoken to, he existed at the centre of decisions he could not influence. Stirling Castle itself seemed to embody this contradiction. Its thick defensive walls offered protection from enemies beyond. Yet, within those same walls, plots and suspicions quietly took root. Tutors were chosen carefully. Servants were vetted. Guards were doubled. The kingdom could not afford to lose its king. And so, while most children of his age learned simply to crawl, or to speak their first uncertain words, James was already being prepared for a life shaped by duty, expectation, and danger. In the years to come, he would remember little of these first moments. Yet the decisions made on his behalf during this time would shape the man and the monarch he would eventually become. As the days slowly turned into seasons, the rhythm of the castle became the rhythm of James's world. Morning light would creep gently across cold stone walls, illuminating dust that floated quietly in the still air. Footsteps echoed through corridors long before their owners appeared, and voices often seemed distant, as though carried from another life entirely. For the young king, childhood unfolded within carefully guarded boundaries. Windows revealed vast landscapes of rolling hills, forests touched by mist, and distant roads that led to places he would not yet see. Yet within the castle, life followed patterns shaped by caution and responsibility. Lessons began early. Books, heavy and bound in leather, were placed before him as soon as he was able to sit steadily at a table. He was taught language, scripture, and the complex expectations of kingship long before he could fully understand their meaning. Those who instructed him believed they were preparing a ruler, but in doing so, they quietly reshaped his childhood. Games were fewer, freedom was limited. Even laughter, when it came, seemed softened by the awareness that this small boy carried the weight of a kingdom upon his shoulders. Outside, Scotland itself remained restless. Messengers arrived with news of unrest, of shifting loyalties, of noble families watching one another with growing suspicion. The castle gates opened and closed with deliberate care. Torches burned late into the night. And somewhere beyond the walls, the memory of James's mother lingered. A reminder that crowns could be lost as quickly as they were given. In quieter moments, when tutors had departed and guards stood silently at their posts, the young king was left alone with his thoughts. He would gaze into hearth fires that crackled softly in the darkness, or listen to the distant howl of wind sweeping across the battlements. These small experiences, barely noticed at the time, shaped his understanding of the world. Power, he would learn, was rarely loud. It moved quietly, like shadows stretching across a chamber at dusk. It waited, patient and unseen. And as James grew, so too did the awareness that his life would never belong entirely to himself. As the young king grew beyond infancy, Scotland itself continued to be ruled not by him, but in his name. A succession of regents governed the kingdom during his childhood, each attempting to maintain stability in a land still unsettled by religious conflict and noble ambition. Authority shifted quietly from one figure to another, like the passing of a torch in a darkened hole. For James, these changes were distant, yet deeply significant. He remained the symbolic center of power. A child whose presence legitimized decisions he neither made nor fully understood. Within the protective walls of Stirling Castle, his education became increasingly structured. Tutors were selected not only for their learning, but for their political reliability. Among them was George Buchanan, one of the most renowned scholars in Scotland. Buchanan believed that kings should be wise, disciplined, and morally accountable to their people, ideas that were bold, and sometimes unsettling in an age when monarchs were often viewed as divinely appointed rulers. Under his supervision, James's days were filled with study. Latin texts were read aloud in echoing chambers. Classical histories described the rise and fall of empires, the ambitions of generals, the fragile nature of power. Scripture was memorized carefully. Lessons in rhetoric and philosophy encouraged the young king to think deeply, even as he remained surrounded by watchful eyes. Discipline could be severe. Buchanan was known for his strict methods, believing that hardship built strength of character. In later years, James would remember this period with a mixture of respect and quiet resentment. Outside the classroom, the world of the Scottish court unfolded in ways both fascinating and troubling. Noblemen travelled to Stirling to pledge loyalty, or to observe the king whose authority shaped their fortunes. Conversations were often conducted in lowered voices. Decisions were weighed carefully, alliances reconsidered, ambitions concealed behind polite expressions. Even as a boy, James began to sense that power was rarely straightforward. It existed not only in crowns or titles, but in influence, persuasion, and timing. In the evenings, when the formal duties of learning had ended, he would sometimes walk the quieter corridors of the castle. Servants moved softly about their tasks. Torches flickered against ancient stone. Beyond narrow windows, the Scottish landscape stretched into darkness, vast, unknowable, waiting. These solitary moments offered a kind of freedom that daylight did not. Here, the young king could simply observe, listening to distant winds or the muted clatter of armor as guards changed their watch. Yet even in these peaceful intervals, he remained aware that his life was guided by expectations far older than himself. The crown he had inherited as an infant was not merely an ornament of gold. It was a promise, a burden, and perhaps a destiny still slowly revealing itself. As James grew older, the fragile balance of power in Scotland became increasingly difficult to ignore. Though still young, he was no longer shielded entirely from the realities of rule. The kingdom he would one day govern was not calm, nor united, but alive with competing ambitions, shifting loyalties, and quiet suspicions that lingered like mist over the hills. Noble families continued to maneuver for influence. Meetings were arranged in private chambers. Letters travelled by trusted messengers across rough countryside and storm-lashed coastlines. Promises were made, reconsidered, sometimes quietly broken. For James, these movements were at first difficult to understand. He had been taught about kingship in books, about justice, honour, and divine responsibility. Yet the living world around him revealed a more complicated truth. Authority was rarely absolute. Even a crowned monarch could become vulnerable if those around him chose to test the limits of loyalty. This truth became painfully clear during the dramatic events known as the Ruthven Raid. In the year 1582, a group of Protestant nobles seized control of the young king, effectively placing him under their supervision. It was not a battlefield capture filled with clashing steel, but a quieter, more unsettling moment. Power had shifted through planning, persuasion, and sudden resolve. James found himself surrounded not by enemies, but by men who claimed to act in the kingdom's best interest. Days passed beneath watchful scrutiny. Conversations were measured. Movement was restricted. The rhythms of his life, once shaped by tutors and ceremony, were now determined by political necessity. Though still a boy, he began to observe carefully who spoke confidently and who hesitated, who offered reassurance and who avoided his gaze. These experiences quietly shaped his understanding of human nature. He learned that power could be both visible and invisible. That influence often operated through suggestion rather than command. That survival sometimes depended not on strength, but on patience. Outside the chambers where decisions were made, Scotland continued its daily life. Farmers tended fields beneath wide grey skies. Traders guided horses along muddy roads between distant towns. Church bells marked the passing of hours that felt ordinary to most, yet momentous to those living within royal walls. From high windows, James could look across landscapes that seemed timeless. Rivers wound steadily through valleys. Mountains stood unmoved by politics or ambition. In such views there was a strange comfort, a reminder that kingdoms rose and fell, but the land endured. Eventually, alliances shifted once more. Supporters of the king worked quietly to restore his freedom, and control began to return gradually to his own hands. Yet the memory of captivity did not fade easily. It remained like a shadow at the edge of thought. influencing decisions long after the moment itself had passed. In the years that followed, James would become increasingly skilled at navigating the dangerous theatre of court life. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he revealed. Beneath a composed exterior, his mind continued to gather lessons about trust, authority, and the delicate balance required to hold a divided kingdom together. These early trials did not break him. Instead, they forged a quiet resilience that would define the monarch he was slowly becoming. As the months unfolded, life within the royal court settled into a strange rhythm, outwardly calm, yet quietly tense beneath the surface. For the young King James, each day followed a pattern shaped not by childhood curiosity, but by careful supervision and silent expectation. From the moment he woke in his chamber of heavy stone walls and narrow windows, attendants were already present, moving gently through the morning light, like figures in a carefully rehearsed play. They spoke softly, they watched constantly. Meals were taken at long wooden tables, polished smooth by generations of use. Silver cups reflected the flicker of candlelight, and servants stood ready at every moment, ensuring that nothing disturbed the fragile order of the court. Yet even in these moments of routine, James sensed something deeper, an invisible current of caution that seemed to flow through every conversation and gesture. He began to notice how words were chosen carefully in his presence. Questions were answered, but rarely explained. Smiles appeared, but did not always reach the eyes. It was a world of subtle signals. Beyond the walls of Stirling Castle, Scotland continued its slow turning through the seasons. Autumn winds carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves across the battlements. Winter followed with long nights and frost that crept like silver lace across the window panes. Fires burned constantly in great hearths, their warmth offering comfort against both the cold air and the quiet uncertainty that lingered within the court. Sometimes James would stand beside those windows and look outward across the rolling landscape. From such heights, the lives of ordinary people seemed distant and peaceful. Smoke rose gently from village chimneys. Thin tracks wound across hills where shepherds guided their flocks. Rivers glimmered faintly beneath pale skies. In those distant scenes, there were no whispered plots, no guarded alliances, no unspoken fears. Yet he knew that even beyond the castle, the kingdom remained divided. Religious change had reshaped Scotland in profound ways. The Protestant Reformation had altered traditions that had stood for centuries, leaving uncertainty in its wake. Some nobles saw opportunity in this transformation, while others mourned what had been lost. In this fragile landscape, the young king's future decisions carried immense weight. Though still only a boy, James was already becoming a symbol, a living representation of hope, stability, and power. Tutors instructed him in languages, scripture, and governance. They spoke of ancient rulers and distant empires, of strategy and diplomacy. Their lessons were delivered patiently, yet always with an undercurrent of urgency. The kingdom could not afford weakness. It could not afford hesitation. And so his education became relentless. Even moments meant for rest were shaped by expectation. Walks within the castle grounds were accompanied by guards who remained just out of earshot. Games were organized carefully, chosen for their dignity rather than their joy. Childhood itself seemed filtered through the lens of responsibility. In quiet hours before sleep, as firelight dimmed and shadows stretched across the stone floor, James would listen to the sounds in the castle settling into stillness. the distant closing of doors, the fading murmur of voices, the steady sigh of wind moving through narrow corridors. These were the sounds of a life already bound to duty, though he could not yet fully understand the forces shaping his destiny. He sensed that the choices made on his behalf would echo far beyond these walls, shaping not only the man he would become, but the future of two kingdoms. As the young king moved gradually from childhood toward adolescence, the world around him began to reveal itself in sharper detail. He was no longer merely present at court. He was becoming aware of its rhythms, its performances, and its quiet deceptions. Ceremonies continued to mark the passage of time. Noble visitors arrived in fine cloaks trimmed with fur, their boots dusted from long journeys across rugged countryside. They knelt before the king with carefully practiced humility, offering words of loyalty that were polished by repetition and expectation. Yet even as he accepted their gestures, James sensed that power did not always reside in such visible displays. He began to understand that influence often moved unseen. It traveled through private conversations held late at night, through letters sealed with wax and carried across mountains by trusted riders, through alliances formed not in grand halls, but in narrow chambers lit by a single trembling flame. These realizations came slowly, settling into his thoughts like snow upon winter fields. The memory of his earlier confinement lingered, though he now moved with greater freedom within the court. The knowledge that authority could be taken from him, quietly, decisively, remained close at hand. It shaped the way he listened. It shaped the way he spoke. He learned patience. Where others argued openly, he observed. Where some demanded immediate action, he considered the longer path. Such habits would later define his rule. Beyond the castle walls, Scotland itself seemed to mirror this sense of waiting. Markets continued in busy towns. Ships arrived in coastal harbours bearing goods from distant lands. Farmers worked fields beneath skies that shifted endlessly between sunlight and cloud. Life endured, steady and resilient. Yet beneath this ordinary movement lay the tension of a nation still searching for stability. Religious divisions had altered loyalties that once seemed unbreakable. Noble families watched one another with careful attention, aware that fortunes could change as quickly as the turning tide. In such a landscape, the young king's growing awareness became a quiet source of strength. His tutors encouraged intellectual curiosity. He read widely, exploring history, theology, and philosophy. Stories of ancient rulers offered both inspiration and warning. He learned how ambition could build empires, and how mistrust could bring them crashing down. These lessons resonated deeply. For James, kingship was no longer an abstract idea tied to ceremony or tradition. It was becoming a living responsibility, one that demanded subtlety as well as courage. In moments of solitude, he would walk along the castle's outer walls, gazing across valleys softened by evening light. The wind carried distant sounds of livestock and flowing water, reminders of the vast kingdom that lay beyond his immediate reach. Somewhere within that landscape were people who looked to him for guidance, even though they had never seen his face. This awareness stirred a quiet determination. The child who had once been carried into a hall to receive a crown was slowly transforming. Observation was becoming strategy. Reflection was becoming resolve. And though he could not yet foresee the path ahead, James was already preparing, consciously or not, for the moment when power would finally rest in his own hands. As the years passed and the uncertainties of childhood slowly gave way to the responsibilities of youth, James began to sense that the moment was approaching when he would no longer be ruled, but would rule. The kingdom had shaped him through caution and adversity. Tutors had sharpened his mind. Experience had taught him patience. Now, standing at the threshold of adulthood, he started to recognize the subtle ways in which authority could be reclaimed. Power, he had learned, did not always arrive with dramatic declarations or sudden change. Often it returned quietly, through confidence, through careful decision-making, and through the steady accumulation of trust. Within the royal court, his presence began to carry new weight. Where once he had listened from the edge of conversation, he now took part in discussions that would shape the future of Scotland. Noblemen who had previously viewed him as a figurehead began to see a ruler emerging, thoughtful, observant, and increasingly aware of the delicate balance required to maintain peace in a divided land. The great halls of Stirling and Edinburgh became spaces not only of ceremony, but of strategy. Maps were studied beneath flickering candlelight. Messengers arrived bearing news from distant regions where loyalties remained uncertain. Decisions were considered with care, each choice carrying consequences that could ripple across the kingdom. James understood that stability would not come easily. Religious tensions still lingered. Old rivalries had not vanished with the passing of regents. Yet he also recognized that Scotland longed for continuity, for a sense that the turmoil of previous decades might finally give way to quieter governance. He began to cultivate an image of calm authority. Public appearances were measured and deliberate. His words, though softly spoken, carried increasing conviction. He sought to present himself not as a child who had inherited a crown, but as a monarch prepared to guide his people through uncertain times. In private, he reflected often on the lessons of his upbringing. The memory of captivity, of whispered conspiracies, of decisions made without his consent, all remained present. They served not as wounds, but as reminders. Reminders that leadership required vigilance, that trust must be earned slowly, that power once lost could be reclaimed only through wisdom and restraint. Beyond the palace walls, Scotland continued its quiet endurance. Villages rose with the dawn. Traders crossed rugged passes where mist clung stubbornly to the ground. Coastal winds carried the scent of salt and distant storms. Life moved forward with a resilience that inspired both humility and determination in the young king. He began to travel more frequently, observing the land he ruled not as an abstract idea, but as a living tapestry of communities, traditions, and hopes. These journeys deepened his resolve. For James, kingship was no longer defined solely by survival. It was becoming a purpose, a role he would shape with increasing confidence as the years unfolded. And somewhere within his growing awareness, another possibility began to take form, a future that extended beyond Scotland itself. As James settled more firmly into his role, he became increasingly aware that ruling Scotland required more than simply holding a crown. It required understanding the people who surrounded him, their ambitions, their fears, and the fragile alliances that held the kingdom together. The nobles of Scotland were powerful figures, each with their own histories, loyalties, and visions for the nation's future. Some had once guided the young king with genuine concern. Others had sought influence through control or persuasion. Now, as James began to act with greater independence, he recognized that stability depended on restoring trust, even where suspicion had long existed. He approached this challenge with remarkable patience. Rather than confronting opposition directly, he listened. Meetings were conducted in quiet chambers, where voices rarely rose above measured tones. Differences were acknowledged, but rarely allowed to harden into open conflict. Through careful diplomacy, he began to draw former rivals back into cooperation. This was not a dramatic transformation. There were no sudden declarations or sweeping victories. Instead, the court slowly changed its rhythm. Conversations became less guarded. Agreements, once tentative, grew more confident. The young monarch's willingness to observe before acting earned him a reputation for thoughtful leadership. Education had prepared him well for such moments. His tutors had encouraged reflection and analysis, teaching him that power could be strengthened through understanding rather than force. Historical examples offered guidance. He had read of rulers who secured loyalty through wisdom, and of others who lost kingdoms through arrogance. These lessons remained close to his thoughts as he navigated the complexities of governance. At the same time, Scotland itself continued to evolve. Trade routes expanded cautiously, linking distant communities with growing regularity. Markets filled with goods carried from both local farms and foreign ports. Ships arrived along rugged coastlines bearing news from beyond the northern seas, reminders that the world was wider than any single realm. James began to see his kingdom not merely as a place of internal divisions, but as part of a broader European landscape shaped by diplomacy, faith, and ambition. This awareness encouraged a more outward-looking perspective. He corresponded with influential figures, seeking to strengthen Scotland's position through alliances and negotiation. His words were chosen carefully, revealing intelligence without provoking unnecessary tension. Such exchanges hinted at a future in which his authority might extend further than anyone yet imagined. Yet even as his confidence grew, he remained mindful of the lessons of youth. He remembered the uncertainty of regencies, the shock of captivity, the long years in which decisions had been made without his consent. These memories fostered a cautious determination. He would not rule through fear, but neither would he allow his authority to be diminished. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of power shifted. The child king, who had once been watched constantly by others, was becoming a ruler who watched and understood the kingdom in return. As James's authority strengthened within Scotland, his thoughts began to extend beyond the familiar landscapes of his own kingdom. From the highest towers of his residences, he could look out across valleys and rivers that seemed timeless. Yet he knew that the political world surrounding Scotland was constantly shifting. Beyond the southern border lay England, a powerful realm ruled by Queen Elizabeth, whose long reign has brought both stability and uncertainty. Elizabeth had no direct heir. This simple fact stirred quiet speculation across Europe. Courtiers, diplomats, and monarchs alike considered what might follow when her era finally came to an end. Among the many possibilities discussed in hushed tones, one name appeared with increasing frequency: James, King of Scots. For the young ruler, such conversations were both distant and deeply personal. He had never met Elizabeth, yet her decisions had shaped the world into which he was born. Her relationship with his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had ended in tragedy. The memory of that history lingered like an unspoken shadow over his own future. Still, James approached the matter with characteristic patience. He understood that ambition expressed too openly could provoke fear or resistance. Instead, he cultivated an image of thoughtful restraint. His correspondence with English figures was courteous and measured, revealing intelligence without suggesting rivalry. He studied the traditions and expectations of English governance. He considered how two distinct kingdoms, each with their own identities, laws, and loyalties, might one day be guided by a single monarch. Such ideas were bold, yet he explored them quietly, allowing possibility to unfold at its own pace. At night, when formal duties had ended and the court settled into silence, he sometimes reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought him to this point. From an infant crowned amid uncertainty, to a youth navigating faction and fear, to a king beginning to shape his own destiny. The journey felt both improbable and inevitable. Outside, the Scottish countryside lay beneath vast skies filled with drifting clouds and distant stars. These constant elements of nature offered perspective. Kingdoms might rise and fall, alliances might shift, yet time itself moved forward with steady purpose. James sensed that his own story was moving toward a moment of transformation. Though he could not yet know when that moment would arrive, or what challenges it would bring, he prepared himself through reflection, learning, and quiet resolve. For somewhere beyond the horizon of his present responsibilities lay the possibility of a crown that would unite realms and redefine the future of Britain itself. As the years moved forward and the rhythms of governance became familiar, the question that had lingered quietly across Britain began to grow more urgent. Queen Elizabeth of England was aging. Her reign had lasted for decades, shaping the political and cultural landscape of the realm with remarkable strength. Yet she had never married, and she had named no direct successor. What had once been a distant uncertainty now became a matter of increasing concern for nobles, diplomats, and ordinary people alike. Across England, conversations turned gently but persistently toward the future. Who would guide the kingdom when Elizabeth's long rule came to an end? Who could maintain stability in a land shaped by religious division, economic change, and memories of past conflict? Among the possible heirs, James of Scotland emerged as a figure of growing significance. His lineage offered legitimacy. His experience offered reassurance. His reputation for thoughtful leadership made him an increasingly acceptable choice to those who feared sudden upheaval. For James himself, the prospect was both extraordinary and deeply complex. England was not merely another territory. It was a powerful neighbour whose history was intertwined with his own, in ways both personal and political. The execution of his mother Mary had been authorised under Elizabeth's authority, an event that had cast a long shadow over his childhood. Yet James chose not to dwell upon resentment. Instead, he recognised that the future required pragmatism. Through carefully worded correspondence and diplomatic restraint, he began to position himself as a natural successor. He avoided open confrontation. He avoided dramatic claims. Instead, he allowed his suitability to become quietly understood. Within the Scottish court, anticipation grew. Messengers arrived bearing reports from London, subtle hints about shifting attitudes among English nobles. Some viewed the possibility of a peaceful succession as a welcome relief. Others remained cautious, unsure how the union of two crowns might reshape their world. James listened to these developments with characteristic composure. He had spent his life learning how power moved beneath the surface. Now he sensed that events were aligning in ways he could neither fully control nor entirely resist. Beyond the borders of politics, nature continued its steady course. Spring returned to the countryside. Rivers swelled with rainwater from distant hills. Fields were sown once more by hands that had little knowledge of the decisions unfolding in royal chambers. Yet those quiet labours formed the foundation of kingdoms, and soon the destiny of two nations would rest upon the shoulders of the king who had once been crowned as a child. On a quiet evening in the early spring of 1603, the long uncertainty that had lingered across Britain finally reached its conclusion. Queen Elizabeth I was dead. The news did not arrive with fanfare or celebration. Instead, it travelled slowly through the darkness, carried by riders who pressed onward across miles of rough terrain beneath cold, starlit skies. Hooves struck damp earth in steady rhythm. Cloaks were drawn tightly against the chill wind. Lantern light flickered and swayed with each movement. History, it seemed, was unfolding in silence. Within the royal residences of Scotland, the night followed its usual pattern. Fires burned low in great hearths. Servants moved quietly along stone corridors, their footsteps softened by woven tapestries and time-worn carpets. Beyond narrow windows, the landscape lay still beneath the vastness of the northern sky. It was in such an atmosphere that word finally reached King James. Messengers, weary from their journey, delivered reports that confirmed what many had anticipated, yet few could fully imagine. The throne of England, one of the most powerful positions in Europe, now stood without its long-serving ruler. For a moment, the weight of this reality seemed almost unreal. James had spent years preparing for the possibility. He had studied the complexities of English politics. He had nurtured alliances carefully, avoiding actions that might threaten his claim. Yet when the moment arrived, it did so not as a dramatic proclamation, but as a quiet turning of history's page. Those present at court watched closely for his reaction. Would he show triumph, relief, concern? Instead, he remained composed. He listened attentively as details were explained. He asked measured questions. He allowed the significance of the news to settle gradually within his thoughts. For James understood that this was not merely an opportunity. It was a transformation that would reshape the identity of both his life and his kingdom. Outside, dawn began its slow approach. A pale light spread across distant hills, revealing frost upon fields of mist rising from rivers that wound steadily toward the sea. Farmers would soon rise to begin their daily work, largely unaware that the balance of power across Britain had shifted during the night. Within the court, preparations quietly began. Letters were drafted, advisors consulted, plans discussed in calm, deliberate tones. The journey south would need to be organized with care, for it represented not only a change of location, but the beginning of a new era. James had been crowned as a child amid uncertainty. Now, as he stood on the threshold of becoming king of another realm, he sensed that the lessons of his past were guiding him toward a future few could have predicted. History had called, and he was ready to answer. In the weeks that followed the death of Elizabeth, preparations began for one of the most significant journeys of James's life. He would travel south from Scotland to London, leaving behind the kingdom he had ruled since infancy, and moving toward a future that would unite two crowns under a single monarch. The news of his succession spread steadily across both realms. In England, officials proclaimed him king with careful ceremony, seeking to ensure continuity and calm. After decades of uncertainty about the future, the peaceful acceptance of James's claim brought a sense of relief to many. There were no major uprisings, no rival claimants strong enough to challenge the transition. Instead, Britain entered a rare moment of political stability. For James, however, the reality of what lay ahead was immense. His journey began amid scenes of formal organization and quiet anticipation. Advisors worked tirelessly to arrange routes, accommodation, and security. Courtiers prepared to accompany him. Messengers traveled ahead to announce his progress. When at last he set out, the roads before him stretched through landscapes he had never fully known. He passed through rolling countryside where villages gathered to watch the royal procession. Some greeted him with enthusiasm, hopeful that this new era would bring prosperity and peace. Others observed more cautiously, uncertain how a Scottish king would govern the powerful kingdom of England. At each stop along the route, James encountered the varied character of his future realm. Market towns bustled with trade. Rivers carried barges laden with goods. Great estates stood as symbols of long-established English nobility. The journey itself became a moving introduction to the people whose lives he would soon influence. Yet beneath the outward spectacle, the transition remained deeply personal. James was leaving behind familiar surroundings, castles whose corridors he had walked since childhood, landscapes that had shaped his understanding of kingship. Ahead lay a capital unlike any he had known, a court governed by traditions both similar and strikingly different. He travelled with measured dignity. Contemporary accounts describe him as composed and attentive, greeting those who approached him while maintaining an awareness of the immense responsibility he now carried. For the first time in his life, his authority extended beyond the boundaries of Scotland alone. By the time he neared London, anticipation had grown across the city. Crowds gathered along streets and bridges, eager to witness the arrival of their new sovereign. The peaceful nature of his succession was widely regarded as a blessing, offering hope that years of tension might give way to stability under a united crown. When James finally entered the capital, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a ruler invited by circumstance and accepted by necessity. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun with uncertainty in a Scottish castle. Now standing at the heart of a greater kingdom, he prepared to write the next chapter of British history. With his arrival in London, James entered a new phase of life unlike anything he had previously experienced. He was now King of England as well as Scotland, the first monarch to hold both crowns simultaneously. This moment, known to history as the Union of the Crowns, marked a profound shift in the political landscape of Britain. Though the kingdoms remained legally distinct, they were now governed by a single ruler, whose decisions would shape the direction of both nations. London itself presented a striking contrast to the Scottish courts James had known. The city was vast, crowded, and alive with activity. Narrow streets wound between timber-framed houses. Merchants called out from busy markets. Ships filled the River Thames, bringing goods and ideas from across Europe and beyond. For a king raised amid the windswept landscapes of Scotland, the scale of England's capital was both impressive and demanding. His court expanded accordingly. Advisors from two realms now sought his attention. Matters of governance multiplied. Religious tensions persisted in different forms, requiring careful management and diplomatic awareness. James approached these challenges with the same measured intelligence that had guided him through the uncertainties of his youth. He believed strongly in the idea of unity. Throughout his reign, he promoted the concept of Britain as a single, harmonious entity, a vision that extended beyond traditional borders and rivalries. Though complete political union would not occur in his lifetime, his efforts laid foundations that future generations would continue to build upon. At the same time, his personal life adapted to new realities. He spent increasing amounts of time in England, gradually becoming more familiar with its customs, landscapes, and people. Royal progresses allowed him to travel across the countryside, observing firsthand the diversity of the realm he now ruled. In quiet moments, he reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought him here. From the infant crowned amid uncertainty, to the youth shaped by faction and fear, to the monarch presiding over two kingdoms. The journey had been neither simple nor predictable, yet it had revealed a truth that James understood deeply: that history often moves through the lives of individuals in ways both subtle and profound. Beyond the walls of palaces and parliaments, the people of Britain continued their daily routines. Farmers tended fields beneath changing skies. Artisans shaped wood and metal in workshops scented with smoke and resin. Scholars debated ideas in candlelit chambers, contributing to the intellectual life of an era that would later be remembered as a time of transition and discovery. Through it all, the presence of a single sovereign offered continuity. James's reign would be remembered for many things: for political negotiations, for cultural developments, for the commissioning of the English Bible that bore his name. But above all, it represented a turning point when the destinies of Scotland and England began to intertwine more closely than ever before. Standing at the centre of this transformation, he carried forward the lessons of his past and the possibilities of a future still unfolding. As the years of his dual reign passed, the idea of Britain as a shared realm slowly began to settle into the consciousness of those who lived within it. Though Scotland and England remained separate kingdoms in law, the experience of being governed by one monarch created subtle changes in how people imagined their place in the wider world. Travel between the nations became more common among nobles, merchants, and scholars. Political discussions increasingly reflected concerns that extended beyond regional borders. Even ordinary lives were touched in small ways by the shifting balance of power. James himself continued to pursue stability. He sought peace where conflict had once defined relationships. He encouraged dialogue between religious groups at a time when divisions could easily lead to unrest. His court became a center for intellectual exchange, drawing writers, theologians, and thinkers whose work would influence generations to come. Among his most enduring contributions was his support for a new translation of the Bible into English. Completed in 1611, the work that came to be known as the King James Bible would shape language, literature, and spiritual life across the English-speaking world. Its rhythms and phrasing echoed through churches, homes, and classrooms for centuries. In this way, James's legacy extended far beyond the political structures of his reign. He became part of a cultural inheritance that would continue to evolve long after his own lifetime had ended. Yet, history doesn't move in a single direction. While his vision of unity laid important foundations, tensions between kingdoms and identities did not disappear overnight. The challenges of governance remained complex, shaped by changing economic realities, shifting alliances, and the ambitions of future rulers. Still, the moment when a Scottish child became King of England marked a turning point that could not easily be undone. It represented the beginning of a new chapter in the story of Britain, one in which shared experience gradually reshaped old assumptions. If one were to walk through the landscapes of these nations in the years that followed, the signs of continuity would be everywhere. Rolling hills patterned with stone walls, villages gathered round ancient kirks, rivers winding through valleys that had witnessed centuries of quiet human endeavour. Above them all, the same wide skies stretched from the highlands to the southern fields. Kings would come and go, parliaments would rise and fall, borders would be debated, defended, and reimagined. But the memory of that fragile beginning, when an infant king inherited a destiny far larger than himself, would remain woven into the fabric of history. And so, as the light of evening settles across both kingdoms, the story gently draws to its close, not with finality, but with the understanding that history is always continuing. As this story comes to a close, you may wish to continue your journey through the quiet paths of history. There are many more moments waiting to be explored, from great battles and royal intrigue, to the slow unfolding of everyday life in centuries long past. If you would like to drift further into Scotland's story tonight, you can simply allow the next video to begin. Thank you for spending this time here. Rest well, and let history continue to unfold around you.